deployed warships and aircraft today to track Russian vessels as they make their way to Cuba.
That's right. Last week, Moscow launched vessels toward the Caribbean for a series of planned military exercises.
However, marinetraffic.com shows one of the ships came within, get this, 30 miles of Key Largo, Florida. The Biden administration maintains that there is no threat to the U.S.
The U.S. sending warships and aircraft to keep an eye on a convoy of Russian vessels over in the Caribbean Sea. Those ships are not too far from the Florida coast where they were spotted, and they appear to have now reached Cuban waters. Russian soldiers aboard one stood in military formation as they did approach the island. U.S. officials have said they expect the Russian ships will remain in that region through the summer.
The big news making international headlines: a nuclear-powered Russian submarine and 3 Russian ships arrived in Cuba today. What are these warships doing so close to the United States?
Hundred miles from Florida tonight, 4 Russian warships steaming into Havana Bay, including a nuclear-powered submarine. The U.S. tracking this with a show of force. They are set for military drills, these Russian ships, with Cuba for the first time in 16 years.
Tonight, a brazen display of Russian military force just over 100 miles from Florida's coast. Russia's longtime ally, Cuba, welcoming 4 Russian warships, including a nuclear-powered submarine with a 21-cannon salute.
The Russians have not conducted a drill like this in 16 years, but this morning a brazen display of Russian military power just about 100 miles off the Florida coast. Cuba welcoming 4 massive Russian warships, including that nuclear-powered submarine, and one of those warships armed with a missile that the Russians claim can move so rapidly it can evade detection. The Russian ships have already conducted drills on the Atlantic even before reaching Cuba, drills that involved simulating an attack on targets in the sea more than 300 miles away. Cuba has had Russian warships routinely dock in Havana Bay, but again, it has been a very long time since Russia conducted these kinds of military drills. The Pentagon is downplaying it, saying there's no threat, but it is clearly a provocative move, and the U.S. and Canadian navies are shadowing these ships, monitoring them closely over this multi-day exercise.
It's not the first time Russian warships have pulled into Cuba, but U.S. officials say this appears intended by Vladimir Putin as a high-profile response to the Biden administration's support for Ukraine. The frigate has been used in the past to test one of Russia's newest hypersonic missiles. 2 American destroyers plus 2 ships specially equipped with sonar for tracking the submarine, along with Navy patrol planes, even sail drones, shadowed the Russian flotilla as it made its way across the Atlantic into the Caribbean. A nuclear-powered submarine in Havana evokes memories of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
President Biden on the world stage at a summit of world leaders in Europe. At the top of the agenda is helping Ukraine in its fight against Russia.
President Biden is kicking off the G7 summit here in Italy, meeting and shaking hands with global leaders. And his priority here is to ramp up efforts to stop Russia's war in Ukraine. In just a few hours, he'll be meeting with Ukraine's President Zelensky to sign a historic long-term security agreement. Now, while this does not commit U.S. troops to defend Ukraine, the U.S. is pledging to bolster Ukraine's defenses. It's meant to show Vladimir Putin that America is determined to stand by Ukraine no matter how long it takes. The U.S. is also dramatically increasing sanctions on Russia, and the U.S. is also pushing for a $50 billion loan to Ukraine using profits from frozen Russian assets.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un called his country an invincible ally of Russia in state media Tuesday, while rumors swirl that President Vladimir Putin is set to visit. Marking Russia's National Day, Kim said his meeting with Putin last year strengthened their century-old strategic relationship. The message followed a report that Putin will soon visit North Korea and Vietnam, but no date has been confirmed. Kim visited Russia last September, touring the Vostochny Cosmodrome spaceport in the Russian Far East, where Putin promised assistance in satellite construction. Tuesday's state media report also had Kim praising Russia for achieving success in building a strong nation, despite facing pressures from, quote, hostile forces. In the past year, Pyongyang and Moscow have boosted diplomatic and security ties and traded delegations in recent months. A North Korean public security delegation was scheduled to visit Russia this week. Officials in Washington and Seoul have accused North Korea of exchanging weapons for use in Russia's conflict in Ukraine in exchange for aid with its nuclear and missile programs.
Jesus said, as a sign of his coming and the end of the age, there would be an increase in deception, false Christs who will deceive many, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, Christian persecution, apostasy, false prophets, and lawlessness, causing the love of many to grow cold. Jesus said all of these signs would come like birth pains. Jesus was likening last days events to a woman in labor. As the labor progresses, the pains increase in both frequency and intensity until the baby finally comes. As we get closer to Jesus' return, all the signs he gave us as a sign of his coming and the end of the age will become more frequent and more intense. All of these signs are manifesting around the world in our time.
If you didn't think World War II was the possibility of Christ returning, I don't know what was wrong with you. Except maybe you had read enough of the Bible to go, there's not enough, to say it's this time. We've got Gog and Magog. For the very first time, conspiring against evil, against Israel. Yeah. I mean, nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
But doesn't it looks,
Brother Glenn, all the players are in place. Okay, so the big difference between right now and even World War II is the existence of the state of Israel.
Right.
That's the prophecy. I'm sympathetic with some student of prophecy from 200 years ago who says, well, this is never going to happen. How in the world could the Jews ever repopulate the nation of Israel? Mm-hmm. It's just the greatest miracle. Mm-hmm. And so that miracle, that sign, it seems to me, Glenn, announced that we're in the final days. Because so many things, Israel has to be a nation for many of the prophecies to be fulfilled, namely the reconstruction of the temple. And so there has to be a national Israel in order for many of these things to happen. Well, now it wasn't there 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, but it's there right now. And so I think the discussion of what we're seeing on the world stage is a discussion that we need to have both politically, but even more important, spiritually. Because something is happening here that has never happened in any generation in history. I don't know when Christ is returning. I don't. Mm-hmm. No one knows.
Yeah.
But we are told to look for the signs. In fact, Jesus was critical of those religious leaders. He said, you see red sky at morning, you know it's dawn, but here I've given you sign after sign and you have not watched. And so there's an expectation that in addition to viewing what's happening geopolitically, we have to interpret it spiritually.
I will tell you that I've said so many times here recently, when the Bible was being put together, it's not like God said, the Jesus part, we went all soft. Let's go out with a bang. Let's freak everybody out in the last book of the Bible. He didn't do that. He gave that to us so we would not be freaked out. He gave it to us so we'd look and we'd know that great change is coming.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. He did these things not to scare us, but to prepare us. He told us these things so that we would not panic. See to it that you are not troubled, Jesus said the night before his crucifixion. And then in the Olivet Discourse, or the sermon about end times, Jesus said in Luke 21, lift up your eyes, your redemption draws near when you see these things coming. So rather than panic, which nobody faults anybody for their anxiety these days, but knowing what's next prepares us to face what's now. And if we can know what's next, if we can begin to get a semblance of what's about to happen, then I believe that allows us to land at a spot that says, okay, God said something like this was going to happen. I'm going to look up. I'm going to make sure my relationship with him is solid, and I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to lean heavily into God's word for help.